The Harrington mansion stood on the northern edge of Atlanta, tucked behind iron gates that stretched higher than most trees. From the outside, it seemed alive, fountains spraying arcs of water into the air, gardens trimmed with a precision that spoke of wealth, and gardeners paid handsomely. But inside silence ruled. No sound of laughter echoed down the endless marble halls. The house was polished to perfection, but it felt more like a museum than a home. At the heart of this cavernous place lived Elijah Harrington, a 7-year-old boy with soft blonde hair and gray eyes that rarely lit up. His father, Arthur Harrington, one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, had built his empire on real estate and banking. But for Elijah, that empire meant nothing. The boy's world was one of solitude. His mother had passed away when he was only 2, and though the photographs of her still decorated the walls, smiling, vibrant, elegant, he had no real memory of her warmth. Every evening the staff prepared a grand dining table that could seat 20, yet Elijah ate alone at one end, the opposite chair reserved for a father too busy with late meetings, phone calls, and business dinners. A rotating cast of nannies and tutors came and went, offering structure but never comfort. Their job was to keep the boy quiet, educated, and in line. None of them stayed long. Elijah cried too much. They often whispered, shaking their heads as they packed their bags. The truth was simpler. Elijah was lonely. He cried at night when the house grew even quieter than during the day. His sobs would echo faintly through the corridors, bouncing off cold marble floors and glass chandeliers, swallowed by the vastness of the place. The boy would clutch his blanket, curl into himself, and beg for sleep that refused to come. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories like this one. During the day, Elijah drifted through the mansion like a ghost. He would wander into the library where books towered from floor to ceiling, but he never touched them. He would sit on the grand staircase, staring at the doors that never opened for visitors. He watched the gardeners from the window, envying the way they talked to each other, laughing, wiping sweat from their brows in the Georgia heat. When Arthur did appear, it was often brief. He would pat Elijah's shoulder, ask if he was doing his lessons, then disappear into his office with a leather briefcase full of contracts. Elijah would nod, hiding his yearning for more than quick questions. He longed for a voice that stayed, for arms that held, for someone to whisper that he wasn't alone. Sometimes he would sneak into the parlor where a grand piano sat, untouched. He would press a few keys softly, then stop, afraid the sound might draw scolding from whichever caretaker was on duty. They rarely encouraged exploration, preferring Elijah to sit quietly with flashcards or handwriting drills. The mansion demanded order, and order left little room for laughter. At night, the boy's fear grew strongest. He hated the size of his bedroom, the way shadows stretched too far across the walls. The massive windows looked out onto the dark lawn, and every rustle of the trees sounded like footsteps. He would press his palms over his ears, but his tears still came. The pillows dampened under his face, and still no one came to check on him. There was one evening when his crying grew so fierce that the butler knocked softly, asking if everything was all right. Elijah choked back his sobs and whispered yes, because he had learned that showing pain only made people uncomfortable. The butler left. The silence returned. And so it continued, days of polished emptiness, nights of restless crying. Elijah was a boy surrounded by every comfort money could buy, yet stripped of the one thing he needed most. The mansion gleamed, but it had no heartbeat. The Harrington name carried power, but in Elijah's small chest, the weight of that legacy was suffocating. The child cried because it was the only language left to him, the only sound that reminded him he was alive. But within those walls no one seemed to hear. Yet fate was shifting. The mansion, for all its silence, was about to receive a new presence, someone who would walk through those sterile halls with a warmth that neither wealth nor discipline could replace, someone who would hear Elijah's cries not as noise to be silenced but as a call to be answered. And on the edge of this loneliness, a boy's life was about to change forever. The morning sun poured across the Harrington driveway as a silver sedan pulled up, carrying a woman who had no idea how much her life was about to intertwine with the lonely boy inside that mansion. Loretta James stepped out, adjusting her navy blue jacket and smoothing the front of her skirt. She was 48 years old, her dark skin glowing under the Georgia sun, and though she carried herself with quiet dignity, her eyes held both weariness and determination. She had raised 3 children on her own, working jobs that demanded long hours and little gratitude. To her, this new position was simply another way to provide, but she sensed it would be different the moment she saw the towering house. Inside, the staff moved with clockwork efficiency. The butler, Mr. Carrington, introduced her to the strict rhythm of the mansion. "You will handle the daily cleaning, oversee the laundry, and keep out of sight unless called," he instructed in a clipped voice. "Mr. Harrington values discretion above all else." Loretta nodded politely, though inside she bristled. She was used to working hard, but the way the house seemed to demand silence unsettled her. She noticed it immediately. No photographs of children's art, no clutter from toys left on the floor, no smell of home-cooked meals drifting from the kitchen. Everything gleamed, yet nothing breathed. Loretta thought of her own modest home back in Decatur, filled with the chatter of her grown children whenever they visited, the mismatched furniture that carried memories in every scratch and dent. Compared to that, this mansion felt like a shell. On her first day, she worked diligently, dusting polished surfaces and folding linens that seemed barely touched. But while she polished the stairway banister, she sensed eyes on her. She turned and saw him, Elijah. The boy stood at the top of the stairs, holding onto the railing, his small frame almost swallowed by the oversized hallway behind him. His grey eyes studied her with a guarded curiosity. "Good morning," Loretta offered softly, smiling as she would to one of her own children. Elijah didn't answer. He lingered, silent, then turned and disappeared down the hall. Loretta carried on, but she felt the weight of his gaze long after he had gone. She would glimpse him again later, peeking from behind a doorframe as she carried laundry baskets, or sitting quietly on the edge of the kitchen entrance while she mopped the floor. The boy didn't speak, but his presence was unmistakable, like a shadow that wanted to be noticed. That evening, as she finished tidying the grand dining room, she overheard Arthur Harrington's voice through the study door. "Remember the rules," he was telling the butler. "The staff is here to work, not to meddle. I don't want Elijah forming attachments. He needs structure, not softness." Loretta paused, her hand tightening around the rag she held. She had worked for demanding employers before, but the coldness in Arthur's tone struck her deeply. A child without attachments. She shook her head, whispering under her breath, "That ain't living." Later, as she placed fresh towels in the upstairs hallway, she heard it. Faint, muffled crying coming from behind a closed door. She froze, her heart tightening at the sound. It wasn't the polite whimper of a spoiled child denied a toy. It was raw, aching, and lonely. She wanted to knock, to push the door open, to tell whoever was inside that someone cared. But Carrington's earlier warning and Arthur's words pressed against her mind. Her job depended on staying in line, so she stood there, torn between instinct and duty, until the crying softened into silence. With a heavy breath, she moved on. Still, that sound followed her into the night. As she left the mansion and drove back to her small apartment, Loretta thought of her own children, remembering nights when they had cried after scraped knees or broken hearts. She had always been there to hold them, to remind them they weren't alone. The Harrington boy didn't have that, and though she had been told to keep her distance, Loretta felt something stir inside her. She didn't know it yet, but Elijah's silence and his tears would soon reach her in a way she could never ignore. The first week passed quietly. Loretta kept to her duties, sweeping through the endless rooms, polishing surfaces that never seemed to gather dust, and folding linens embroidered with the Harrington crest. The mansion demanded order, and she gave it, but she couldn't ignore the boy. Elijah's silent watching became a pattern. He would linger at the edge of her vision, peeking from behind doorways, slipping away the moment she turned toward him. He was a presence more than a participant, like a ghost haunting the home he lived in. It was late one evening when the walls betrayed him. Loretta had just finished arranging the laundry when she heard it again. Soft at first, then breaking into ragged sobs. The sound came from the hallway upstairs, behind the large oak door she now knew was Elijah's. She froze, clutching the folded towels, her chest tightening. She glanced up and down the corridor. The other staff had already retired to their quarters, the house quiet except for the boys' muffled cries. Loretta approached the door slowly, her heart aching at each sound. She hesitated, hand raised, but Arthur's warning echoed in her mind. "I don't want Elijah forming attachments. He needs structure, not softness." Loretta lowered her hand, torn. She had raised 3 children. She knew the cry of loneliness, the cry of fear in the night. But she was just the maid here. Crossing that boundary could cost her the job she desperately needed. For long minutes she stood in the hallway listening. Finally she whispered to herself, "Baby, somebody's got to hear you." She hurried back to the linen closet, searching through shelves until she found an extra blanket. She carried it back to Elijah's door, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. Carefully, she placed the folded blanket on the floor with a small note tucked into its corner. The words were simple, written in her round, steady hand. "You're not alone." She stepped back, staring at the closed door as if willing the boy to notice. Then she walked away, her chest heavy with both fear and hope. Inside, Elijah's sobs slowed. He had heard the soft rustle outside his door and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Hesitant, he slid off the bed, padded across the rug and cracked the door open. His eyes fell on the blanket and then the note. He picked it up with trembling fingers, reading the words over and over. Something in his chest loosened, as though the sentence itself wrapped him in warmth. He carried the blanket back to his bed, clutching it tightly. That night, though his tears still came, they were softer, and sleep finally found him. The next morning, Loretta arrived in the kitchen earlier than usual. She hummed softly as she prepared the cleaning supplies, but her mind was elsewhere. She wondered if Elijah had found the blanket, if he understood the message. She doubted he would say anything, but the thought of him sleeping a little easier gave her comfort. As she moved through her chores, she caught sight of him again, standing in the hallway. This time he didn't vanish when their eyes met. He stood there, silent, clutching the blanket in his arms. Loretta offered him a warm smile, her gaze lingering with quiet reassurance. He didn't speak, but he didn't run either. For the first time there was no wall between them, only a fragile thread of trust beginning to weave itself in the silence. That night, when Loretta left the mansion, she carried the image with her. Elijah standing still, holding on to the very thing she had left for him. It wasn't a conversation, but it was a beginning. And deep inside the boy's guarded heart, something had shifted. The kitchen of the Harrington mansion was the only place that carried even a hint of warmth. Unlike the marble corridors and polished rooms that echoed with emptiness, the kitchen smelled of butter, coffee, and baked bread. Loretta found comfort there. She worked with steady hands, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast trays and tidied the counters. On one particular morning, as the sun climbed through the tall windows, her humming turned into singing. Her voice was low, rich, and steady, carrying an old gospel tune her grandmother used to sing while cooking in Alabama. The song spoke of carrying burdens, of hope rising like morning light. Loretta's voice filled the room, brushing against the silence like a soft blanket. She thought she was alone, but she wasn't. Elijah stood quietly in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sound. His small fingers clutched the blanket she had left him nights before, now his silent treasure. He watched her from the threshold, his grey eyes fixed not on the food, but on her lips, moving with the melody. When Loretta turned and noticed him, she didn't startle. She simply smiled, her voice easing into the final verse, before she set down the spoon she was using to stir oatmeal. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently. Elijah hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What's that song?" Loretta dried her hands on a towel and leaned on the counter. "It's a gospel song, sugar. Something my grandma used to sing when the day felt heavy. Helps you remember there's always light coming." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Why do you sing it?" "Because it makes the work feel lighter," she answered honestly. "And sometimes when your heart feels heavy, singing lifts it a little." The boy thought for a long moment. His world had been built on silence and rules, on formal greetings and quick dismissals. Music felt like a language he had never heard spoken in his home. "It sounds warm," he said, as though testing the word. Loretta's smile deepened. "That's exactly what it is." Before Elijah could say more, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Arthur Harrington appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately stiffening the air. He wore his usual tailored suit, tie perfectly knotted, expression sharp. His eyes moved from Loretta to Elijah and back again. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cool. Elijah lowered his head, clutching the blanket tighter. Loretta straightened her back, meeting Arthur's gaze without flinching. "Just making breakfast, sir," she said calmly. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Breakfast should be served in the dining room. And Elijah, his tone sharpened, "You know better than to linger in the kitchen." "That's not your place." Elijah swallowed hard, a flush rising on his cheeks. He didn't move. Loretta sensed his hesitation and spoke softly, careful not to challenge, but unwilling to let him retreat into shame. "He was just asking about a song, Mr. Harrington. Nothing more." Arthur's jaw tightened. He glanced once more at his son, then turned his attention back to Loretta. "You are here to work, not to entertain. Remember your role." His words cut through the air like a blade. "Yes, sir," Loretta replied evenly, though her stomach turned at the coldness in his tone. With that, Arthur pivoted and strode down the hall, the echo of his shoes lingering long after he disappeared. The silence that followed was heavy. Elijah still clutched his blanket, staring at the floor. Loretta approached slowly, crouching to his eye level. "Don't you worry, baby," she said softly. "A song don't hurt nobody. You can always ask me about it." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes glistening with a quiet mix of fear and gratitude. He didn't smile, but he didn't turn away either. Something inside him stirred, fragile and unfamiliar. He had seen his father's sternness countless times before, but this was different, because for once someone had stood steady beside him, not above him. That morning, Elijah ate his oatmeal in silence, but his mind replayed the sound of Loretta's voice. Warmth. That was the word he had chosen, and it stayed with him like a secret flame. And though Arthur's reprimand had closed the kitchen door, Elijah knew he would find his way back there again. The mansion's dining room always looked like a stage set for royalty. A crystal chandelier hung above the long mahogany table, polished until it gleamed. Plates of silver and linen napkins stood ready each morning, though only one chair was ever used. The one at the far end where Elijah sat, small and swallowed by the grandeur. Meals there were silent affairs, food placed in front of him by staff who left without a word. But one morning Elijah didn't go to the dining room. He drifted instead toward the kitchen, pulled by the faint sound of clinking pans and the comforting smell of bacon sizzling. He hesitated at the doorway, remembering his father's command, but his hunger for something more than food tugged him forward. Loretta stood at the stove, her hair tied back with a scarf, flipping pancakes onto a plate. The air was thick with the smell of butter, and beside her on the counter sat a pot of grits, creamy and steaming. She turned, surprised to see Elijah, but her expression softened instantly. "Well, good morning, sunshine," she said warmly. "You hungry?" Elijah nodded faintly, clutching his blanket in one hand. He glanced toward the hallway, half expecting Arthur to appear and scold him again. But the house was quiet. Loretta wiped her hands on her apron and tilted her head toward the back porch. "Come on, let's take this outside. Air's too nice to waste." The back porch overlooked the garden, where roses climbed the trellises, and the breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was a place rarely used, yet it felt alive in the morning light. Loretta set 2 plates on the small round table there, pouring orange juice into glasses. Elijah sat hesitantly across from her. He picked up his fork, staring at the pancakes. They were thick, golden, with butter melting into the surface. He took a bite, and his eyes widened slightly at the taste. It was simple, sweet, warm, nothing like the cold fruit platters and carefully arranged soufflés that usually sat in the dining room. "Good?" Loretta asked, sipping her juice. Elijah nodded quickly, chewing before whispering, "Better than what they usually make." Loretta chuckled softly. Well, sometimes the best meals are the simple ones. She cut into her pancake, then added, "My grandma used to say food tastes better when you got company." Elijah looked up at her, the corner of his lips twitching as if a smile wanted to break free. "You eat with your kids like this?" "Every chance I got," Loretta replied. "We'd sit on our old porch in Decatur, eating pancakes or biscuits, laughing about something silly. Didn't matter how little we had, it always felt like plenty." For a moment, Elijah imagined it, a table crowded with voices, plates being passed, laughter rising and falling. The picture warmed him in ways he didn't expect. He took another bite, then whispered, "I wish I could eat like this every day." Loretta's heart clenched. She reached across the table, not to touch him, but to rest her hand on the wood between them. "Baby, you deserve mornings that make you feel full, not just in your belly, but in here too." She tapped her chest lightly. Elijah's fork paused midair. His eyes softened, and then, almost shyly, a sound slipped out. Light, quick, like a bird breaking free. A laugh. It startled even him, and he covered his mouth quickly, as though afraid he'd done something wrong. Loretta's smile widened, her voice gentle. "Now that's the sweetest sound I've heard in this house." For the first time in weeks, Elijah didn't rush through his meal. He lingered, asking questions about Loretta's favorite foods, listening as she described her mother's peach cobbler and her father's love for strong coffee. The sun climbed higher, and the porch filled with something the mansion had lacked for too long: life. When Elijah finally stood wiping his mouth with a napkin, he glanced toward the kitchen and then back at Loretta. "Can't I come again tomorrow?" Her chest swelled with quiet pride. "Darling, this porch'll be here waiting on you." And with that, the boy stepped back inside, carrying with him not just the taste of pancakes, but the memory of laughter he hadn't known he still had. The day began like any other, with the shuffle of servants preparing rooms and the low hum of activity, before the mansion settled into its usual hush. Elijah sat stiffly in the study, a notebook open before him, as his tutor droned on about arithmetic. The boy's grey eyes glazed over, his small hand gripping the pencil but never moving. Numbers and equations meant little to him. They floated like meaningless symbols while his heart grew heavy. "Elijah," the tutor snapped, tapping the desk. "Focus. Your father expects progress." The boy flinched. He hated the study room. Its tall windows let in too much light, and the shelves of leather-bound books made him feel smaller than he already did. His throat tightened, and he fought the urge to cry. Finally, in a burst of defiance he didn't fully understand, he pushed the notebook aside, slid off the chair, and bolted out the door. The tutor shouted after him, but Elijah's footsteps carried him down the corridor, quick and frantic. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look. His small frame darted into the service wing, and without pausing he opened a narrow door and slipped inside. The broom closet smelled of pine cleaner and old wood. Bottles clinked as he leaned back against the shelves, his chest heaving. It was dark, cramped, but for once he felt hidden. Minutes passed. His breathing slowed, but the sting of frustration lingered. He hugged his knees to his chest, wishing someone would understand. The door creaked open. A strip of light cut through the darkness, and there stood Loretta, her brows lifting in surprise. "Well now," she murmured, "if this ain't the last place I expected to find you." Elijah's eyes widened. "Don't tell him," he whispered quickly. Loretta crouched down, her knees protesting against the floor. "Don't tell who, baby? The tutor? Or my dad, please?" His voice cracked, trembling with fear and desperation. Loretta studied him for a moment, her heart aching. She stepped inside, letting the door ease shut behind her. In the dim light, she saw the boy's flushed cheeks and tear-bright eyes. "Looks like you had yourself a rough lesson," she said gently. Elijah buried his face in his knees, his voice muffled. "Nobody really talks to me. They just tell me what to do, all the time." Her chest tightened at the weight in those words. She reached for a rag hanging from a hook, fiddling with it as she gathered her thoughts. "When I was your age, I felt the same way sometimes. Folks told me what I couldn't do, what I wasn't good enough for. I remember sitting on my grandma's porch crying about it. Elijah peeked up at her. "What did you do?" "I listened to her stories," Loretta said softly. "She used to say, 'Life's gonna try and box you in, child, but you don't gotta stay in that box. You can make your own space, one piece at a time.'" The boy tilted his head, the words stirring something inside him. "But I'm just a kid." "I can't do anything." Loretta leaned closer, her voice steady. "You can do plenty. You can listen, you can feel, you can decide what kind of person you want to be, and you can keep your heart open even when the world feels closed." Silence filled the closet, but it wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Elijah's shoulders relaxed a little, and for the first time he felt as though someone was speaking with him, not at him. He whispered, "It's easier when you talk." Loretta smiled, her eyes soft. "That's because I see you, baby. Not the grades, not the rules. Just you." The words settled over Elijah like a blanket. He nodded slowly, clutching the edge of his shirt as though anchoring himself to the moment. Loretta finally stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Now, how about we sneak out of here before someone wonders where I lost my mop?" A faint laugh escaped Elijah's lips, quick but real. He stood and followed her, the air of the mansion somehow lighter around him. For the rest of the day, the broom closet lingered in his thoughts, not as a hiding place but as the first spot in the entire mansion where he felt heard. The study was a room Elijah had always hated, its towering shelves of books, the heavy oak desk, and the constant smell of leather and paper made it feel like a courtroom, more than a place for learning. But that afternoon, it held something different. Elijah sat cross-legged on the rug while Loretta perched in a chair, her hands folded in her lap. The boy's face was animated as he listened to her recount childhood tales from Alabama, stories about fishing trips with her brothers, chasing fireflies on hot summer nights, and learning how to cook cornbread from her grandmother. Elijah's gray eyes widened with each detail. "You really caught fish with just a stick?" he asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "Sure did," Loretta chuckled. "Took a whole afternoon sometimes, but when we finally pulled one in, it felt like we'd caught a treasure." The boy laughed, the sound light and surprising, like a bell in the still room. For once, the mansion felt less like stone and more like home. But the moment shattered. The study door opened sharply, and Arthur Harrington strode in, his presence filling the room with a chill. His eyes flicked from Elijah on the floor to Loretta in the chair, narrowing with suspicion. "What's going on here?" Arthur's voice was low, clipped. Elijah froze, his laughter dying instantly. Loretta rose from her seat, her back straight. "Just sharing a few stories, sir, nothing more." Arthur's gaze hardened. "You are here to clean, not to play storyteller. Elijah, get up. This is not how you should be spending your time." The boy's chest tightened. He wanted to obey, as he always did, but something inside him snapped. His small hands balled into fists against the rug. "I like her stories," he blurted, his voice trembling with emotion. Arthur's brows shot up, his face tightening with shock at the defiance. "Excuse me?" "She listens to me," Elijah shouted, his cheeks flushed, tears welling in his eyes. "Nobody else does. You don't, you never do." The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, like a wound torn open. For a heartbeat, the entire room was silent. Arthur's lips pressed into a hard line, his jaw clenching. He looked at his son, then at Loretta, his expression a storm of anger, and something else he refused to name. Loretta took a slow breath, her heart pounding. She could see the boy's desperation, the years of loneliness spilling out all at once. She also saw the father's pride, rigid and wounded, standing like a wall between them. "Elijah," Arthur said sharply, his voice trembling at the edges, "that is enough." But Elijah shook his head, his small body quivering. "No, it's not enough. I don't care about the books or the lessons. I just want—" His voice broke, the tears finally spilling down his cheeks. "I just want someone to stay." Arthur's eyes flickered as if the words struck deeper than he expected. He turned away, pacing a short distance before gripping the edge of his desk with white knuckles. His son's sobs filled the silence. Loretta's instinct screamed at her to step forward, to place a hand on Elijah's shoulder, but she held back. This wasn't her battle to win. It was a truth the father needed to hear. Finally, Arthur straightened, his tone cool, though his face betrayed strain. "Go to your room, Elijah. Now." The boy hesitated, staring at him with eyes that begged for understanding. Then, with a choked breath, Elijah ran from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Loretta remained standing, her hands clasped tightly together. Arthur's eyes met hers, cold and accusing. "Stay within your place," he said flatly before turning back to his desk. She left without a word, her chest heavy. Yet in the echo of Elijah's defiance, she knew something had shifted. The boy had spoken the truth, and whether Arthur admitted it or not, he had heard it. That night, long after Elijah's footsteps had faded up the stairs, and Loretta had retired to her quarters, Arthur Harrington remained in the study. The room smelled faintly of bourbon, the kind he poured into a crystal glass when numbers on a page no longer distracted him. He leaned back in his leather chair, the boy's voice echoing in his head. "She listens to me. You never do." Arthur set the glass down with a sharp clink. He had built his empire by listening to no one but himself, by hardening against weakness, by turning silence into power. Yet those words from his son pierced through him in a way hostile boardrooms and courtroom battles never had. He rubbed his temples, remembering his own childhood in Birmingham. His father, a factory worker, had been a man of few words and heavy hands. Arthur had grown up knowing that comfort was earned, not given, and that tears were wasted energy. He had promised himself, as a young man working nights and studying days, that his children would never lack anything, except he had never considered that anything might mean more than money. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. It was Carrington, the butler, carrying a stack of documents. "Sir, these need your review before tomorrow's board call." Arthur waved him off impatiently. "Leave them." Carrington hesitated, then asked carefully, "Is the boy all right?" Arthur stiffened. "He's fine. He just needs discipline." The butler gave a slow nod, though his eyes lingered. "Sometimes, sir, children don't need discipline as much as they need presence." With that, he placed the papers on the desk and left quietly. Arthur exhaled, unsettled. Even Carrington, measured professional Carrington, seemed to side with his son. Later that week, in an unusual step, Arthur scheduled lunch with one of his oldest confidants, Richard Hale, a retired lawyer who had known him since his early career. They met at an upscale steakhouse downtown, a place Arthur usually associated with deals and negotiations. Richard studied him across the table. "You look troubled, Arthur. Not business, I take it?" Arthur sipped his water, then said bluntly, "It's Elijah. He's rebelling, shouting, saying things he doesn't understand." "What things?" Arthur hesitated before repeating the words, softer than he intended. "That I don't listen. That he just wants someone to stay." Richard leaned back, his weathered face softening. "Children often know more than we give them credit for. He's telling you his truth." Arthur's tone sharpened. "He's a boy. He doesn't know what he needs. My job is to make him strong, capable. I can't coddle him." Richard cut his steak slowly, then spoke with deliberate calm. "Arthur, strength without love turns into emptiness. You know this better than most. Tell me, when you think of your father, do you remember strength or the lack of kindness?" The words hit hard. Arthur looked down, his appetite gone. Memories surfaced of his father's silence at the dinner table, the way he had dismissed Arthur's youthful dreams as foolishness. He remembered swearing never to be like him, yet in Elijah's eyes he saw the same absence he had once felt. Back at the mansion that evening, Arthur found himself pausing outside Elijah's bedroom. The door was shut, no sound coming from within. He considered knocking, but his hand hovered, then fell. He wasn't ready, not yet. Instead, he walked down the hall toward the service wing, where faint laughter carried from the kitchen. He stopped short when he saw Loretta through the doorway. She was speaking softly with another maid, her face lit by the warmth of her smile. Even from a distance, Arthur could see the calm authority she carried, the way others leaned in when she spoke. He realized she was more than just an employee. She was a presence that drew people in. Arthur lingered there a moment longer, unseen. He clenched his jaw, conflicted. A part of him bristled with jealousy. His son had found in Loretta something he had never been able to give. But another part of him, quieter yet undeniable, wondered if perhaps she had something to teach him too. When he finally turned away, his steps echoed through the hall. The mansion remained as silent as ever, yet Arthur knew the silence no longer belonged only to his son. It belonged to him as well. The storm began just after midnight. Rain hammered against the tall windows of the mansion, and thunder rolled across the Georgia sky. Elijah lay in bed, eyes wide, heart racing with each crash. He clutched his blanket, the one Loretta had once left outside his door, but it wasn't enough. The shadows seemed larger, the silence between the storms louder. His chest tightened until the sobs broke free, raw and uncontainable. He tried to bury his face in the pillow, to quiet himself as he always had, but tonight the fear was too heavy. The cries spilled louder, filling the vast room, echoing off the walls like a plea. Loretta, awake in her small quarters, heard him. She hesitated at first, Arthur's warnings pressing on her mind. But the sound of that child's anguish pulled stronger than fear. She rose, wrapped her robe around her shoulders, and made her way through the dark halls until she stood outside his door. Her hand lingered on the knob for a moment. Then, with quiet resolve, she opened it. Elijah's head shot up, eyes red and glistening. "Loretta," he whispered, voice trembling, "please don't go." Her heart broke at the words. She crossed the room, sat carefully on the edge of his bed, and brushed the damp hair from his forehead. "Baby, you're safe," she murmured. "A storm can't hurt you in here." But Elijah shook his head, tears streaking down his cheeks. "It's not just the storm. I can't sleep. I feel like no one's here. Like I'm always alone." His voice cracked on the last word, his small shoulders shaking. Loretta swallowed the lump in her throat. "You're not alone, sugar. I'm right here." Elijah stared at her, eyes desperate, searching. Then, in a voice almost too small to hear, he asked, Can I sleep here like this?" He shifted, laying his head carefully against her lap. For a moment, Loretta froze. Every rule told her to stop, to stand, to keep her distance. But the boy's trembling body pressed against her resolve, and she knew rules meant nothing compared to this moment. She adjusted herself, resting one hand gently on his back, the other smoothing his hair. Almost immediately, Elijah's breathing began to steady. His tears slowed. He curled closer, as if anchoring himself to the comfort he had long been denied. "You remind me of my mum," he whispered, words slurred with exhaustion. Loretta's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She only kept her hand moving gently through his hair, humming the faintest line of the gospel tune he had once asked about. The melody filled the silence, soft against the thunder outside. Within minutes, Elijah's body grew heavier, as sleep finally claimed him. For the first time in years, the boy rested without fear, his small hand gripping the fabric of her robe as if letting go would shatter the peace. Loretta looked down at him, her chest aching with both tenderness and sorrow. She hadn't come to this house expecting more than work, but now she found herself holding a child whose soul was starving for love. She vowed silently that, whatever the cost, she would not let him feel abandoned again. The storm outside raged on, but inside the vast, cold mansion, there was finally calm. And as the hours passed, Elijah slept soundly, his face softened by dreams that carried no tears. The next morning, Elijah woke with his head still resting against Loretta's lap. Sunlight filtered through the tall curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. For a moment he didn't move, afraid the comfort might vanish if he opened his eyes fully. When he finally stirred, Loretta's hand slipped gently from his hair. "You slept straight through, baby," she said softly. "First good rest I've seen on you yet." Elijah rubbed his eyes, blinking against the light. A small smile touched his lips. "I didn't dream bad things this time." Loretta's chest swelled with quiet relief. "That's 'cause you weren't alone." From that night on, a shift began to take place inside the mansion. It was subtle at first, Elijah's posture relaxing, his laughter slipping out more easily. He started eating heartily again, especially when Loretta prepared simple meals that reminded him of the porch breakfasts they shared. At school, his teachers noted that he spoke more in class, answered questions instead of shrinking into silence. Word traveled quietly among the staff. They noticed the boy's brighter demeanor, the way his eyes followed Loretta with trust instead of suspicion. In whispered conversations, they admitted that she had done what no nanny or tutor had managed before. She had reached him. One afternoon, as Elijah worked on a puzzle in the living room, one of the maids paused to watch. "Never seen him sit so calm before," she murmured. Loretta only smiled, her hands busy with polishing the silver. She didn't take credit. It wasn't about her. It was about the boy finally finding a space to breathe. But not everyone shared the warmth. Arthur Harrington watched these changes from a distance. He noticed Elijah running into the kitchen instead of the study, noticed the laughter drifting from the porch in the mornings, noticed how often the boy carried that blanket Loretta had given him. On the surface, Arthur should have been grateful. His son was thriving, but instead a sharp edge of unease grew in him. One evening, standing in the hallway, Arthur paused by the living room door. Elijah sat on the rug, Loretta beside him, both of them bent over a book. The boy's laughter rang out when Loretta teased him about mispronouncing a word. Arthur's throat tightened. The scene was undeniably tender, yet it stirred something he didn't want to name. Was it jealousy? The thought unsettled him. His son had never looked at him that way, with such unguarded joy. That night, as Arthur poured himself a drink in the study, Carrington entered quietly. "The boy seems much improved, sir," the butler remarked. "Whatever Mrs. James is doing, it's working." Arthur frowned, swirling the liquid in his glass. Perhaps too well. Carrington tilted his head. "So with respect, sir, happiness is not a threat." Arthur said nothing, but his silence betrayed the conflict warring inside him. Meanwhile, Elijah continued to thrive in Loretta's presence. He didn't ask for explanations of love. He simply felt it in her patience, in the way she listened, in the quiet company she offered without demand. The trust between them grew not through grand gestures, but through the silence they shared, the kind of silence that comforted instead of suffocated. One night, as Loretta tucked a blanket around his shoulders on the porch, Elijah whispered, "I don't cry as much anymore." Her hand lingered gently on his shoulder. "That's 'cause you know somebody's hearing you now, even when you're quiet." He looked up at her, eyes soft with gratitude. No words followed, but none were needed. Trust had been earned, not in speeches or promises, but in the stillness of being truly seen. Inside the mansion, marble floors still shone and chandeliers still glittered. But in corners where laughter once had no place, warmth now lived quietly, reshaping everything. Arthur could sense it too, and though he didn't yet know how to face it, he could no longer ignore that something inside his house and inside himself was changing. Arthur Harrington was not a man who enjoyed waiting, but he made Loretta wait that evening. He had summoned her to the study after dinner, his voice carrying that clipped tone that allowed no room for refusal. Now she stood in the doorway, her apron folded neatly, her face calm, though her heart beat heavily in her chest. "Come in," Arthur said finally, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. His office smelled faintly of cigar smoke and ink, the walls lined with books that seemed untouched except for display. The large leather chair and gleaming desk only heightened the sense of authority he wielded like a weapon. Loretta stepped forward, her shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "You asked for me, sir." Arthur leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His grey suit was immaculate, his hair combed precisely, but his eyes carried an exhaustion that pride would not let him show. "Yes. Sit." She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The air was thick, tense, as though the room itself demanded confrontation. Arthur began slowly, his tone cool. "I've observed a change in my son since your arrival. He laughs more, speaks more. The staff seems convinced this is your doing." Loretta kept her voice steady. "I do spend time with him, yes." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "More than your position requires. You're not hired to be his companion. You're here to work, clean, manage household tasks. Nothing more. Her chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. Begging your pardon, sir, but children don't live on chores and rules. They need more than that. Arthur's jaw clenched. What they need is structure. I won't have Elijah grow soft. He is a Harrington. He has responsibilities he doesn't yet understand. Loretta leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. With respect, Mr. Harrington, what that boy doesn't understand is why no one listens to him, why nobody stays. He doesn't need more walls around him. He needs warmth. The words landed heavily. Arthur's face hardened, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. He tapped a pen against the desk, a nervous tick breaking through his composure. Warmth, he repeated with a bitter edge. Warmth doesn't prepare a child for the real world. Discipline does. Hardship does. Loretta's voice softened, but it carried weight. Hardship comes on its own, sir. The world don't need your help giving it to him. But love, that has to be given on purpose. The room went still. Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line as if her words had struck deeper than he wished to admit. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured lawn lit faintly by the garden lamps. His reflection glared back at him in the glass, successful, powerful, untouchable. And yet, in that reflection, he saw a father who could not reach his son. Behind him, Loretta sat in silence. She knew better than to push further, but she also knew she couldn't take back what she had said. Finally, Arthur spoke without turning. Do not mistake my tolerance for approval. Your position here is fragile. Remember that. Loretta stood, smoothing her apron. Her voice remained steady. My position don't matter near as much as that boy does. You can fire me if you need to. But you can't change the truth of what he's asking for. Arthur turned, his face tight with restrained anger, but he said nothing. Loretta gave a small nod, then stepped out of the study, closing the door quietly behind her. Arthur stood alone, staring at the darkened window. Her words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. Hardship comes on its own, but love has to be given on purpose. The week after their tense conversation, the mansion settled into its usual rhythm of polished surfaces and measured footsteps, but beneath that order lay something unsettled. Arthur Harrington moved through his days with a stiffness even Carrington noticed. He buried himself in meetings, phone calls, and late-night reviews of contracts, but Loretta's words returned like a refrain. Hardship comes on its own. Love has to be given on purpose. Elijah, meanwhile, flourished under Loretta's steady presence. He laughed more, spoke with greater ease, and even approached his lessons with a spark of curiosity when she encouraged him. Arthur observed these changes from afar. At first, pride prickled into jealousy, his son turning to someone else for what he could not give. But as the days passed, pride shifted into reflection. Perhaps Loretta's influence wasn't undermining him. Perhaps it was revealing what he lacked. One evening, Arthur lingered at the threshold of the living room. Elijah sat at the low table with colored pencils spread out, sketching clumsy figures while Loretta watched nearby, her knitting needles moving steadily. The boy looked up at her with open affection. Arthur cleared his throat and both turned to him. Elijah stiffened automatically, but Arthur's voice was softer than usual. Elijah, you have a school event coming up, don't you? The fall recital? The boy nodded slowly. Next Friday. Arthur shifted his gaze to Loretta. Would you consider accompanying him? It might help. Loretta blinked, surprised. Sir, that's not usually part of my duties. Arthur hesitated, pride tugging against vulnerability. I'm asking because he trusts you. If you're there, perhaps he'll feel more comfortable. Elijah's eyes widened with hope. Can she, really? He asked, his voice eager, almost pleading. Arthur looked at his son, saw the longing, the need, and gave a short nod. Yes, she can. When the night of the recital arrived, the school auditorium buzzed with chatter. Children in neatly pressed outfits waited backstage, while parents filled the rows. Elijah clutched his violin, his palms damp with nerves. Loretta crouched beside him, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "You got this, baby," she whispered, her voice steady. "Don't worry about playing perfect. Just play with your heart." Elijah nodded, drawing courage from her presence. When it was his turn, he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight glaring. His bow shook at first, the notes uneven, but as he caught sight of Loretta in the audience, her eyes steady on him, her smile calm, he found his rhythm. The music carried him, simple but true, and when the final note faded, polite applause filled the room. Elijah scanned the crowd, heart hammering, and spotted Loretta clapping proudly. Next to her, Arthur sat stiffly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shone with something Elijah had rarely seen, emotion breaking through restraint. Afterward, in the hallway, children reunited with their parents. Elijah rushed to Loretta first, throwing his arms around her waist. "You stayed," he whispered, relief flooding his voice. "Of course I did," she said, hugging him tightly. Arthur approached slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "You played well, Elijah." His voice was awkward, almost foreign in its gentleness. The boy looked up, unsure, but when Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture held sincerity. Then Elijah did something unexpected. He pulled Loretta closer and said without hesitation, "This is my second mom." The words froze Arthur in place. Loretta's eyes widened, caught between pride and fear. She glanced at Arthur, expecting anger, perhaps even dismissal. But Arthur's face softened, his eyes shimmering with something unguarded. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "She's certainly been important to you." Elijah nodded firmly. "She listens." Arthur looked at Loretta again, and in that moment no words were exchanged, yet something shifted. For the first time, he acknowledged not just her presence but her role in his son's life. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of beginnings, something fragile, but real. The days following the recital were marked by a subtle but noticeable shift. Elijah's steps were lighter, his smile more frequent. It wasn't that the mansion had changed. Its marble floors still gleamed under the light. Its walls still stood cold and tall. But within those walls, something was beginning to warm. Elijah started to approach Arthur more often, though still hesitantly, as though testing the waters. And each time Arthur's stern facade seemed to crack just a little more. It wasn't immediate, but over time there were moments, small quiet moments, when Elijah could see his father not as an imposing figure, but as someone who might, just maybe, understand. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Elijah took a deep breath before entering the dining room. He had grown used to the lavish spread of food, the silence that had once defined their meals. But tonight felt different. Tonight he wasn't sure why, but he needed something more. Something had changed in him since the recital. As he sat at the end of the long table, Loretta entered the room carrying a tray of freshly baked rolls. She set them down next to Elijah, offering him a quiet smile as though encouraging him silently. Elijah looked around at the perfectly set table, the grand chandelier casting soft light over the polished silver and fine china. His eyes drifted to Arthur, who had yet to speak, his attention focused on a stack of papers he'd brought to the dinner table. But tonight Elijah didn't want to be ignored. He swallowed and cleared his throat, his voice small but clear. "Dad, can Loretta sit with us?" "She's always at the table in the kitchen. Why can't she sit with us?" Arthur paused, his hand resting on his glass of wine. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual, the question hanging in the air between them. For a long moment, Arthur didn't respond. His gaze flickered to Loretta, who stood quietly beside the table, her hands folded, waiting. Then slowly Arthur set his papers down and looked directly at Elijah. "Loretta's place is wherever she's needed," Arthur said, his voice steady but not dismissive. "If you're asking her to sit at this table, then yes, she can sit with us." Elijah's eyes widened, unsure if he had heard right. "Really?" Arthur nodded, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "Yes." "Really?" Loretta's heart skipped a beat. She had long ago resigned herself to the boundaries of her role in the Harrington house, the invisible walls that separated her from the family. To be invited to sit at the table wasn't just a gesture, It was a recognition, a small but significant step that said she was no longer just the maid, but something more. With a quiet nod, she seated herself at the table, carefully placing her napkin in her lap. The meal began, the clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation filling the space. Elijah, for the first time, didn't look at his father with uncertainty or fear. He glanced from Arthur to Loretta, then back again as though waiting for something else, some sign of approval or acknowledgement from the man he had once feared. Arthur spoke first, his voice calm, but more open than it had been in days. "So, Elijah," he said, looking at his son, "how was school today?" The question, though simple, felt like a bridge being built between them. Elijah hesitated for only a moment before he answered. "It was good. I played the violin again in class." Arthur smiled, a small curve of his lips. "I'm glad to hear that. You've been practicing, haven't you?" Elijah nodded, his eyes brightening. "Loretta helps me with the notes. She says I have to be patient." The conversation, though still tentative, began to flow. Loretta joined in, her voice soft and genuine, asking about Elijah's day, guiding him through the gentle exchange. It was the first time the table wasn't filled with silence or tension. For the rest of the meal, the conversation continued, quieter but more meaningful than it had ever been before. They spoke about simple things, what they had read in the news, a small joke from one of the servants, but in that simplicity, there was a sense of connection. Elijah found himself smiling, and for the first time, he felt that this meal, this moment, wasn't just a formality. It was a shared space, a space he had longed for. As the meal came to a close, Arthur leaned back in his chair and glanced around the table. "I think we should do this more often," he said, his voice low but firm. Elijah's heart skipped. "You mean like this? With Loretta at the table?" Arthur gave a slight nod. "Yes." "Like this?" Elijah beamed, his eyes shining with a joy that Loretta had only seen once before, in the days when his mother was still alive. But now, it wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a new beginning. The days following their first meal together at the table were quieter, but filled with an unmistakable shift. Arthur Harrington, once a man of strict boundaries, began to engage more. Not just with Elijah, but with Loretta as well. His presence around the house became less like a distant figure hovering over the mansion, and more like someone who might, just might, be starting to understand the weight of the space he'd neglected for so long. He still worked tirelessly in his study, but there were moments now when he paused in the doorway, observing Elijah and Loretta from the hallway. They sat together on the porch, their voices rising in laughter. Elijah holding his violin as Loretta gently corrected his posture, guiding him through the notes. One evening, Arthur stepped out into the garden, his shoes making soft impressions in the damp grass. He hadn't expected to find them there, but there they were, Elijah leaning against Loretta's shoulder, her arm around his back, both looking out at the horizon as the last light of day faded into twilight. "Is it always like this?" Arthur asked, his voice surprisingly quiet. Loretta turned her head slightly, her gaze catching his, but she didn't stand. Instead, she just nodded, her voice gentle. "Sometimes, sir. Sometimes it's quiet, but it's never empty." Arthur stood there, rooted in place. There was a vulnerability in her words that he hadn't anticipated, a sense of peace that seemed to rise from the very air around them. "I never realized," he began, then trailed off, shaking his head. It wasn't easy for him to put words to feelings he had long buried under the weight of his work, his ambition, his duties. Loretta waited, offering him the space to speak, the same quiet patience she always gave Elijah. Finally, Arthur stepped closer, standing at the edge of the porch. "I don't know what I've been doing, Loretta. With Elijah, with everything. I thought I was protecting him, preparing him, but I never considered that maybe he needed something I didn't know how to give." Loretta turned to him fully now, meeting his gaze directly. "We can't give what we don't have ourselves, sir." And for Elijah, he needed to know someone cared enough to stay. Arthur looked away, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. He felt a pang of regret, a gnawing truth that had been sitting in the back of his mind for far too long. "I was afraid," he muttered. "Afraid that if I didn't push him, he wouldn't be strong enough, that I'd be failing him." Loretta's voice softened. "You can't make someone strong by making them afraid. Strength comes from knowing you're seen, heard, and loved." Arthur turned his eyes back to her, his face unreadable. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Elijah, who had been watching them both from the corner of the porch, suddenly stood up and walked over to his father. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there quietly, his small hand tugging at the sleeve of Arthur's jacket. The older man stiffened at first, unsure of the gesture, but he didn't pull away. For a long moment, they stood there, father and son, two people who had been lost to each other for too long. Elijah's voice broke the silence. "I don't need to be strong like you, Dad. I just need you to be here." Arthur's breath hitched. His son's simple honesty was more profound than any lecture he could have given him. It was the kind of raw truth that broke barriers, that tore down walls. "I'm here, Elijah," Arthur said, his voice rough yet steady. "And I will be from now on." Loretta, standing off to the side, watched as father and son shared that unspoken understanding. A tear slipped down her cheek, though she didn't wipe it away. She wasn't ashamed of it. In that moment she knew the path had been cleared for them both to find each other again. Elijah smiled, his face glowing with a quiet sense of peace. "I knew you'd come around, Dad," he said, his voice full of the innocent hope that only a child could hold. Arthur swallowed hard, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm sorry for taking so long, son." The weight of those words, spoken from a father who had finally realized the importance of love, of presence, hung in the air between them, more powerful than anything he could have said before. And in that moment, Arthur Harrington knew that he had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Love was not something to be earned. It was something to be given. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the mansion began to settle into something more natural. The tension that once suffocated the air had dissipated, replaced by a quiet but palpable sense of peace. Arthur, once a distant figure in his own home, now spent evenings at the dinner table listening, speaking, laughing even. Elijah, with the steady guidance of Loretta, grew more confident, more at ease. And Loretta, who had come to the mansion with only the intention to work, had become the heart of the household in ways she never expected. It was a Sunday morning when Arthur finally made his decision. He sat in his study, papers scattered across the desk, but his mind was elsewhere. His fingers drummed lightly against the surface, the rhythm steady, as if he were preparing for a conversation he'd been putting off for far too long. The mansion was unusually quiet, but that quiet felt different now. It felt like a calm after a storm, one that was inevitable but necessary. Elijah and Loretta were outside as usual on the back porch. He was reading a book, leaning against her shoulder, while she worked on a quilt she had started months ago. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over everything. It was in these moments, when the world seemed still, that Arthur realized what he had been missing. The laughter, the warmth, the simple acts of being together. He had never known how much he had longed for them until they were finally there. Arthur stood, adjusting his tie, and walked toward the porch. When he stepped outside, the fresh morning air met him, crisp and cool. Elijah looked up from his book and smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and made his face glow. Loretta, too, glanced up, her gaze soft but steady. "Morning, Dad," Elijah greeted, his voice bright. "You're up early." Arthur nodded, the words he had prepared finally coming to the surface. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." Loretta set her quilting aside, watching him closely. There was a shift in his tone, something different than before. Arthur had always been a man of few words, but now in the presence of his son and the woman who had become so important to him, his words carried more weight. "I'm sorry," Arthur began, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been distant for a long time. I thought I was doing what was best for you, Elijah, but I see now that I was wrong. You needed more than rules. You needed warmth, Love. You needed someone who would just be there for you, and I wasn't that person. Elijah looked up at him, his eyes wide, as though unsure of the man standing before him. The boy had always wanted his father's attention, but never like this, never with this kind of vulnerability. Arthur continued, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before he looked back at his son. You've changed, Elijah. And that's because of Loretta. She's given you what I couldn't, and I'm grateful for that. Loretta's breath caught, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent years in this house, quietly serving, always keeping her distance, and yet somehow she had found a place in this family, a place she had never expected. Arthur's words, his acknowledgement, brought a warmth to her chest that she wasn't prepared for. Arthur took a deep breath before speaking again. I've asked Loretta to stay with us. I've asked her to be more than just a housekeeper. She's been a mother to you in a way I never could be, and I want her to know she's a part of this family. A real part. Elijah's eyes shone as he looked up at Loretta, a wide smile spreading across his face. You're going to stay? Really? Loretta's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't thought about what it would mean for her, this request from Arthur. But as she looked at Elijah, at the boy who had opened up to her, who had trusted her, who had called her his second mum, she knew there was only one answer. I'll stay, she said softly, her voice full of emotion. If that's what you both want. Arthur smiled, and for the first time in a long while it wasn't just an expression of politeness or duty. It was genuine. It's what we both want. Elijah jumped up from his seat, rushing to Loretta with a burst of excitement. Thank you so much. Loretta hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of years of unspoken longing dissolve in that embrace. Arthur, standing nearby, watched the two of them, his son who had become a boy again in the warmth of someone else's love, and the woman who had shown him how to love without fear. I think this house has finally found its heart, Arthur said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And it's here with all of us. As the day unfolded, the mansion continued to shine, not with the cold gleam of wealth and status, but with the quiet warmth of a family. And in that home, they would continue to build what had been broken, together.